Hello, my name's Paul Prue. I hope you enjoy your journey through Heather on the Vale, a story about paradise, dreams, and the agony of eternal life. To Gnarly and the others who return to live in this story. Where did we come from? What are we doing here? Where are we going? Simple questions deserve simple answers, yet in our complex age, only complex answers seem to flourish. Perhaps scientists, philosophers, and theologians with tangled and inflamed minds are not the ones to query. Perhaps the answers are all around us, cast as shadows upon the earth by a higher reality, accessible to the heart through art, poetry, and metaphor. If so, could it be that life is simply a dream, full of phantasms and distortions, so real in the night, but forgotten at dawn? Perhaps this story may temper the flames, helping the heart to recall another place, forgotten in the night. And in this strange place we call wakefulness, perhaps you too may become a lucid dreamer. Prologue. Philip woke with a start and blinked twice as his eyes began to focus on the folds in Daphne's silken nightgown near her belly. The fabric rose and fell with her shallow breathing, and when he nestled his ear more deeply into her bosom to feel the quiet timbre of her heart, his muscles began to relax. After a short while, his breathing slowed to synchronize with hers, and the dream that had awakened him faded into the background of his mind. Daphne stirred, causing the gently undulating folds in her nightgown to shimmer like small waves on a pond. Startled by the change of rhythm in the fabric that caressed his eyes, Philip woke fully and sat up. With one hand remaining on her shoulder, he propped his pillow against the headboard and slid back, and as he wiped beads of sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, images from the dream returned. He was still thinking about his nocturnal encounter when Daphne rolled toward him and tipped her head to press the warmth of his hand into her cheek, and when she opened her eyes to look up at her husband, he looked into her face and smiled. "Good morning," she said dreamily. Her sparkling green eyes caught his full attention. "It is now," he replied. He slid down into the bed and kissed her on the forehead, then quickly relaxed his face as she leaned back to look at him again, hoping she hadn't seen his brooding expression. She had, of course, but her face didn't show it. She rolled into his side, propped her arm in his chest, and then looked into his deep blue eyes more closely. Before he could speak again, she kissed him on the lips until they both began to smile. Giggles followed, and after frolicking on the bed for a while, they laid back with limbs intertwined and Daphne's head on his chest, listening to the sparrows in the tree outside their bedroom window chatter away. When a young sparrow from the tree flittered onto the windowsill and began chirping at them, Philip let out a tittering laugh, sending Daphne's gently rocking head into a washboard motion. As his solar plexus rippled waves of good humor up his rib cage, she sensed his mood had changed, and she smiled to herself. He was back in the world of the living. Philip leaned back in his wicker chair and took another bite from the pear in his hand while he watched Daphne turn the soil in a flower bed near the center of their garden. Her alabaster skin glowed in the morning sun, and from his raised perch on the back veranda she appeared in the distance like a shimmering white flower in the midst of a bouquet surrounded by other bouquets, as if their many colorful flower beds blossomed from unseen vases planted in the soil. This was the first time they had been more than a few feet apart since they had awakened, and in the relative solitude surrounding him, images of the night began to intrude on his thoughts again. As was his custom on Sunday mornings, he went to the studio and gathered up his easel and paint supplies and brought them out to the veranda, where he positioned the easel to frame the garden in the background. Returning to the studio, he hesitated for a moment, then picked up a canvas from his unfinished painting rack and went back outside. Just as he placed the canvas on the easel, a cheerful voice broke the silence in the backyard. "Good morning," said Amber as she rounded the corner of the house with her husband Kendall at her side. She smiled at Philip and then waved to Daphne as they continued to walk toward the veranda. "Good morning," said Philip. He smiled as his friends approached the steps to the veranda and stopped. "Come on up and sit for a while and enjoy the view." Kendall leaned on the vine-covered railing to get a better look at the painting on his easel. When Amber glanced toward the easel and then looked at her husband, he gave a slight nod of his head toward the garden. She quickly looked back at Philip. "No, thanks. I think I'll go be part of the view. You two have a nice chat," she said. Philip motioned Kendall to join him as Amber began walking toward Daphne, so he climbed the steps to join his childhood friend and neighbor. They had been sitting on their wicker chairs for several minutes, watching their wives tend a flower bed, when Kendall broke the silence. "Like two shimmering flowers in a big bouquet," he said. "My thoughts exactly," said Philip. They continued to look at the garden in silence while Philip mixed paints on his palette, his attention lingering on the countryside, even as his hands busied themselves in preparation for his work. Finally his focus changed and he looked closely at the painting. As he began to stroke a wisp of crimson near the shoulder of one of the figures in his work in progress with a small brush, Kendall's attention was averted from the garden, and both men now focused on the painting. "You had that dream again last night," said Kendall. "Yes, I did," replied Philip as he continued his brush strokes. Kendall watched small beads of sweat form on Philip's brow as he added more color to his brush and then continued his work in silent concentration. Although his friend seemed to enjoy his company while he painted, Kendall was always careful to let him take the lead after their initial comments, knowing his concentration would be unbroken only if the rhythm of their words flowed from the same inner prompting as his brush stroke. He was especially cautious now because when he had watched Philip work on this painting in the past, conversation was usually sparse and unrelated to the images on the canvas. Philip wiped his brush to change colors. "Do you remember when I started this one?" asked Philip. "Yes, it was a long time ago, before the four of us moved up from Briarwood. I don't remember the day you started it, though." He pointed his brush at one of the larger faces in the foreground. "It was shortly after I dreamed this old fellow, about the time we first met Avery and his wife at the town's commons," he replied. Philip mixed some cobalt blue with the crimson on his palette and then began working on the old man's eyes. "I can't seem to get them right," he muttered. "You've changed them over the years. Is the red glimmer a reflection of the background or a glimpse into his soul?" asked Kendall. "Both," came his reply after a short pause. "Tell me, my friend," he continued, "what do you see when you look at this tedious magnum opus of mine?" It was Kendall's turn to hesitate. Philip had never spoken so intimately about this particular painting before, so he chose his words carefully. "Well, it reminds me of the heath to the south of Briarwood in some ways, and it conjures up feelings we shared when we were younger. But to tell you the truth, it seems out of place in character for you now." Philip looked out at the garden and beyond, toward the hill rising from the valley in the distance, and the azure sky that drew his glance even further into space. Out of place now. As usual, Kendall was right. The painting had nothing in common with his life here in Spring Valley, but neither did the recurring dream which drove him to capture it on canvas. Week after week, this time-worn phantasm came to him in the night, and as weeks turned into years, he continued to dredge up its wispy images on the days they were most clear in his conscious mind, in hopes of understanding its meaning. Philip cleaned his brush, turned his chair toward Kendall, and leaned back. "Your words ring true, Kendall. Tell me some more." "There isn't much more to say. It's your painting and your soul poured into the thing. If you'd share your feelings about it, maybe I could understand it better." Philip looked into his friend's eyes. After all these years, perhaps it was time. "You've had recurring dreams with shades of images and feelings from your past that never seem to change over the years, haven't you?" said Philip. "Yes, when I was younger, but not so much anymore." Kendall looked at the painting. "Is it the sheer repetition of the dream that aggravates you?" "Yes, monotony is part of it, but mainly it's the ending that bothers me." "In what way?" "It's a bad one, like a bad ending to a good book. You get into the main character page after page, watch him struggle and survive, waiting for him to change, like a lesson learned or some kind of growth. You wait, and it's not there. And finally you turn the last page expecting some sort of grand epiphany because you've waited so long, and bang, the fellow drops dead." "But don't his good points come out in the end?" "No, and what's worse, this fellow's so resistant to change and growth that when he drops dead he doesn't even know it. Why, then there's no ending at all. Exactly, the worst kind of ending there is, so the dream goes on and the painting never gets finished, said Kendall. Kendall shook his head in disbelief. What a shame. The best part of someone's life is their death. It sums up what has been and points to what will be. And here we have a man who won't even die. There's no has been, no will be, no beginning, no end. I think I'd rather dream about a rock all night. You've got the picture. The agony of eternal life, said Philip with a chuckle. They sat for a few moments, pondering what had been said, until Daphne's cat walked out from behind a flower box and rubbed against Philip's leg, purring softly. Philip smiled at her as she paused to stare at him, and as they watched her wander off toward the garden, Kendall spoke again. The old fellow will change some day, Philip. Everything changes sooner or later, you know. I hope so, said Philip. I'm getting damn tired of this painting. He offered Kendall a pear from a basket on the glass-covered table next to his easel, and then took another for himself. They both turned their attention to the garden and ate their pears in silence. Daphne was on her hands and knees, deeply absorbed in her work, as she combed the dirt around a bed of hyacinth with her fingers. Amber approached unnoticed and watched in silence as her friend moved her hands in a circular motion, working the soft soil between each plant. When Daphne leaned back to wipe beads of sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand, she saw her friend standing there. "Good morning," said Amber. Daphne smiled. "And good morning to you," she replied. Amber got down on her hands and knees and returned the smile. She looked more closely at the soil and then at the beads of sweat on Daphne's forehead. "My, you're awfully thorough with this bed of flowers. Is the soil compacted, or were you looking for something?" said Amber. Daphne sighed. "Actually, I'm looking for something. Since we moved here, I keep finding these in the hyacinth bed." She pointed to a small sprig of heather lying next to her that she had pulled up by the roots. "Heather? Here in the valley? I would have never thought." "I know. The soil isn't right and the sun's too bright, but it keeps coming up anyway." "But there must be something in the soil, or it wouldn't be there," said Amber with a puzzled expression. Daphne stared at her friend for a moment. "Perhaps you're right," she replied. Amber touched Daphne's shoulder. "Heather belongs on the heath. Here, let me help." She got down on all fours and combed the dirt with her fingers. Soon both women were engrossed in their quest to find gnarled underground strands of the unwanted plant. They raked through the soil, starting at the edge and working toward the center, but found no other signs of heather roots. When their fingers met at the rose bush in the middle of the bed, they looked at one another and shrugged. Amber started to work the soil back toward the edge, but Daphne put her hand on her friend's forearm. "No, that's enough for today. Let's pick a bouquet." They picked from the taller twin-stem plants toward the center of the bed, being careful to select only one sister in a pair, and when they were done, both had a brilliant spray of pink, blue, and white flowers cradled in their arms. Daphne got 2 reed baskets from a small work table a few feet from the bed, and while Amber was arranging her bouquet in the basket, Daphne cut 2 long-stem white roses from the rose bush, handing one to her friend. "Come, let's sit by the pool and cool off," said Daphne as Amber placed the rose in the middle of her bouquet. The pool was spring-fed, with a small babbling brook flowing out of it toward the south, and was near the back of the garden on a raised portion of land. It was from a marble bench near a willow tree overshadowing the pool that Daphne enjoyed viewing her garden in panorama, with the house in the background, especially on the days that Philip painted in solitude on the veranda. She seldom asked anyone to join her in this private place, but today she felt the need to share it with her confidant and best friend since childhood. They walked to the pool and knelt at its edge to wash their hands in the cool water, and when they were done, Daphne led Amber across a small footbridge that spanned the brook to sit with her on the bench. They sat for several minutes looking at the garden with their husbands talking on the veranda in the background, and when both men sat back in their chairs to eat something in their hands, their golden skin glowed in the morning sun, catching their wives' attention. "Like 2 shimmering bumblebees hovering over a big bouquet," said Amber, breaking the silence. "Yes, but not so busy pollinating at the moment," said Daphne. They giggled and then looked at their husbands in silence again. Daphne subconsciously picked up a pink flower with wisps of crimson on its petals from the bouquet laying in the basket next to her. She brought it to her nose as her eyes sought out the flower bed that had yielded such wonderful fragrances, and when she began to hum a tune and stroke its petals, Amber looked at her. "He had that dream again last night," she said, breaking the silence. "Yes, he did," replied Daphne. Her hand hesitated, then continued to stroke the petals. Amber and Daphne always spoke to one another from the heart, and when a matter of the heart for one was involved, the other was careful to let the conversation unfold naturally, so Amber waited for her friend to take the lead. Daphne laid the flower in the basket. "He still goes down to Briarwood to visit his old friends, even after all these years," she said. "I know, but it isn't as often now, is it?" "I suppose not, but I feel it's on his mind no matter how often he goes there." "But Daphne, he's finally learning to enjoy life here in the valley. I see it in his eyes more and more every day." "Yes, it's true, but sometimes it seems his old ways of thinking just won't die," said Amber, finishing her thought. They sat quietly, pondering the matter until Daphne's cat walked across the footbridge and up to her owner, rubbing against her leg. "Hello, Celeste," said Daphne as she reached down to stroke her fur. The cat arched her back and then walked over to the edge of the pool as the women watched. When she stopped to gaze into the still waters, Amber spoke again. "He'll change some day. Everyone changes sooner or later, you know." Daphne sighed. "I hope so," she said. "I'm getting tired of pulling heather from the garden." They sat quietly on the bench, pondering the forces tugging at Philip's heart, and musing over an uncertain future until the peaceful joy of their surrounding environment brought them back into the present. They began discussing what to bring to their customary Sunday afternoon picnic at the pavilion in Mineral Springs Park that afternoon, and when it was time to go, they each took the rose from their bouquet, put it in the other's hair, and then held hands as they walked toward the veranda to gather up their husbands for the remainder of their day together. At the end of the day, Amber and Kendall parted company with their friends at the walkway leading to Daphne and Philip's home. As they continued up the lane toward their own home, Amber stopped and turned. "Sweet dreams, you two," she said with a wave of her hand. Philip returned her wave and smiled. "And good endings to yours as well," he said.